The wind howls a lonely song tonight. It claws at arrow slits and scrapes against ancient stone. The sound is a constant reminder of the world outside a world that wants to get in. Inside this fortress, the air is not much warmer. The very walls that protect you from invaders also conspire to steal your warmth. This castle is a magnificent prison of rock and shadow, a place of power, not a place of comfort. Tonight we will learn the secrets of those who slept within these walls. They did not merely sleep, they survived. Welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. Our channel is a doorway to the forgotten nights of history. We explore the quiet truths that daylight often misses. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue to light these candles in the dark. We appreciate you joining us for this exploration of cold and comfort. We hope you find this story both relaxing and fascinating as you prepare for your own peaceful sleep. You stand in the great hall, a cavern of flickering light. A massive fire roars in the central hearth. Its flames paint the rafters with a vibrant orange glow. People gather near its heat, their faces illuminated and smiling. This scene feels warm and alive, a pocket of defiance against the winter. But this warmth is a clever lie, a temporary illusion. Step just a few feet away from the blaze. The cold returns instantly, a sharp and sudden slap. The fire's reach is short, its power limited. The stone walls are silent, hungry giants. They are the true rulers of this castle's climate. They drink the heat from the fire without mercy. They absorb every flicker of warmth from torches and bodies. The walls give back nothing but a deep and permanent chill. This is the great paradox of the castle. Its strength is also its greatest weakness in the fight for survival. The stone that stops a battering ram also traps the frost inside like a tomb. Your journey to bed begins with a climb. You leave the hall's fading light behind. A single torch guides you up a tight spiral staircase. Each stone step is colder than the last. The air grows heavier and more damp with every turn. You are moving upward into the keep's heart, but it feels like you are descending into a frozen well. The warmth from the great fire is now just a distant memory, a memory that cannot help you now. The bedchamber finally greets you with oppressive silence. It is a vast box of frigid air. Your breath hangs in front of your face, a pale ghost in the gloom. The moonlight that slips through a shuttered window is thin and silver. It illuminates a room built for status, not for sleep. The space is too large, too empty, too cold. The grand bed in the center looks less like an invitation to rest and more like an island in a frozen sea. You notice the bed itself stands on a high wooden platform. This was not a matter of style. It was a crucial piece of medieval engineering. The coldest layer of air always settles near the floor. Raising the mattress was a simple trick to escape that biting chill. Servants would even check for drafts along the floorboards, stuffing cracks with rags. Every small detail was part of a desperate nightly battle, a battle that began from the ground up. Yet these small efforts often felt like whispers against a hurricane. A high bed could not defeat the cold that radiated from every wall, the drafts that snaked through every unseen crack. Survival required much more than clever furniture. It required a forgotten science of warmth, a system of layers and rituals. These are the secrets we will now explore, piece by piece. The ingenuity that kept hearts beating through the long medieval night. You look down at the cold chamber floor. It is not bare stone, A thick carpet of dried rushes lies scattered there. This was the first line of defense against the chill rising from the ground. Fresh rushes smelled sweet and grassy, a faint echo of summer meadows. They muffled the sound of footsteps on the flagstones. They created a thin but vital barrier between your feet and the icy stone. This simple layer of plant matter was a small act of defiance, an attempt to bring a piece of the living world into a house of the dead. But this green carpet held a dark secret. The freshness faded within days. Spilled food and ale soaked into the fibers, creating a sour smell. Discarded bones from supper would get lost in the tangles. Mice and other vermin treated the floor as their personal larder and nest. Servants swept the top layer, but the decay underneath festered. By winter's end, the rushes were a foul and compressed mat. The sweet smell of meadow had turned into the stench of a swamp. Now you turned to the mattress itself. For most people, this was a simple sack of coarse cloth. This sack was stuffed tightly with straw, or sometimes dried heather. The straw tick was lumpy and unforgiving. It crackled and rustled with every small movement you made. Sharp stalks would often poke through the fabric, pricking your skin in the night. The mattress had to be shaken and fluffed daily. Otherwise, it would flatten into a hard, unforgiving slab. This was not a bed for comfort. It was a bed for survival. The noble sleeper had a much better option, a deep mattress filled with soft goose or duck feathers. Sinking into this feather bed felt like a warm embrace. It molded to your body and held your heat close. These beds were treasured possessions listed carefully in wills and passed down through generations. But even this luxury had its faults. A sleeper could sink so deep they felt smothered, and the feathers trapped so much heat that one could wake in a sweat even on a cold night. The first layer of fabric to touch your skin was linen. Sheets of linen were smoother than the rough wool that came next. Linen was a breathable fabric that helped manage moisture. It felt cool at first, a startling sensation in the frigid air, but it would slowly warm with your own body heat. Having a clean layer of linen was also a mark of status. It separated you from the straw mattress below and the heavy blankets above. It was a thin layer of civilization in a harsh environment. Above the linen came the true armor against the cold. These were not the soft blankets we know today. They were heavy slabs of woven wool. The fabric was dense, oily, and often scratchy. The weight was immense. Several of these blankets felt like being pinned down. Turning over required a real effort, but their weight was their strength. It trapped air and prevented your body's precious heat from escaping into the chamber's vast coldness. For the very wealthy, there was a final, glorious layer, a coverlet made of animal fur. The thick pelts of fox, sable, or even bear were stitched together. This created a shield of unparalleled warmth. The fur was incredibly soft, a stark contrast to the coarse wool beneath it. It was also a blatant display of power and wealth. To sleep under fur was to announce your high status to the world. It was both a life-saving tool and a magnificent piece of decoration. So the bed slowly becomes a layered fortress. Rushes lie on the floor below. A mattress of straw or feathers supports your body. Linen separates you from the rougher textiles. Heavy wool provides the essential insulation. And for a lucky few, a layer of fur seals it all in. This cocoon of fabric is your only hope. The cold still presses in from all sides, but inside this nest of textiles, you might just stand a chance of seeing the dawn. The fortress of fabric was not complete with blankets alone. The bed frame itself was a crucial piece of technology. This was often a great four-poster bed made of heavy oak. 4 thick posts rose toward the ceiling like pillars in a temple. They were often covered in ornate carvings of vines or animals. This was a piece of furniture that dominated the room. It was a declaration of wealth and power. But its true purpose was not decoration, it was defense. A small room built inside a much larger, colder one. The 4 posts supported a heavy wooden roof above the mattress. This roof was called a canopy. It was not there for grand style. It served a vital function. The canopy stopped cold air from the high vaulted ceiling from sinking down onto the sleeper. It also prevented dust or even small bits of debris from falling onto the bed from the rafters above. It was a simple but effective shield, a solid barrier that protected you from the vast empty space of the chamber. But the real magic of this design hung from the sides. Thick, heavy curtains of wool were suspended from the frame. These curtains were not thin or decorative. They were dense and imposing, much like the blankets themselves. There were curtains for all 4 sides of the bed. They could be drawn completely shut to enclose the sleeper. When opened, they were tied back to the posts with ropes or fabric ties. This structure was the key to creating a survivable space. You reach out a hand and pull the final curtain closed. The change is immediate and profound. The drafts that once chilled your face are suddenly gone. The air inside this small enclosure feels instantly stiller, a pocket of calm in a sea of cold. The heat from your own body now has nowhere to escape. Your own breath helps to slowly warm the trapped air. You have created a personal microclimate, a tiny bubble of warmth engineered against the night. The curtains were made from the densest fabrics available. Thickly woven wool was the most common choice. Its natural lanolin and heavy weave made it an excellent insulator. Wealthier nobles might have curtains of velvet lined with wool for extra protection. Some records even describe curtains made from oiled or waxed cloth, a treatment that made them almost completely windproof. Every thread was a soldier in the war against the cold. The quality of these fabrics could mean the difference between shivering and sleep. This warm tent was not a perfect sanctuary. The air inside could quickly grow stale and stuffy. The smells of unwashed bodies and musty bedding were trapped with you. This created a thick and heavy atmosphere inside the enclosure. There was also the constant danger of fire. A single candle placed too close to the fabric could turn this cozy refuge into a deadly trap. Comfort and danger lived side by side in this small cloth room, a trade-off that people had to accept. Inside this cloth box, the outside world almost disappears. The howl of the wind against the shutters becomes a distant whisper. The footsteps of a guard in the corridor are muffled and faint. You hear only the soft rustle of your blankets and the steady rhythm of your own breathing. This profound silence and isolation was a rare luxury. It created a sense of security that was almost as important as the warmth. For a few hours, you were truly alone and safe from the vast, cold castle. Great lords and ladies valued these beds so highly, they often traveled with them. Servants would be tasked with dismantling the entire heavy frame. They would carefully pack the wood canopy and curtains onto carts. The bed would then be reassembled at the next castle or manor. This was a huge effort, but it was considered essential. The bed was not just furniture. it was a piece of life-saving equipment. One did not simply risk sleeping without their personal fortress. You have your fortress of fabric and wood. Now you must prepare your own body for the coming cold. You do not change into soft pajamas for sleep. That modern idea of comfort does not exist in this time. Sleep is not an occasion for light and delicate clothing. It is a long and dangerous ordeal. People often wore more clothes to bed, not fewer. Their sleepwear was another form of insulation, the final layer between their skin and the unforgiving night. Your primary garment for sleeping is a long linen shirt. For a man it is a nightshirt, and for a woman a chemise. It reaches down to your knees, or even your ankles. This is essentially your underwear, a foundational layer you might not remove for days. The linen is often coarse and simple. It serves to absorb sweat and keep the dirt of your body away from the more valuable woolen blankets. This garment is a constant companion in both waking and sleeping hours. In the brutal depths of winter, this single linen shirt is never enough. You would often pull a woolen tunic on over it. This was frequently the same tunic you wore during the day. Its familiar weight and texture was a comfort. Some people even kept their woolen hose on to protect their legs. The goal was to trap as much body heat as possible. To shed clothing was to invite the cold in. To layer up was to build a personal defense system. Perhaps the most important piece of sleep clothing was for your head. You would wear a simple cloth cap tied snugly under the chin. This nightcap or coif was absolutely essential for survival. People understood that a huge amount of body heat escaped through an uncovered head. The cap was usually made of linen or wool. It protected your ears from the biting drafts. Illuminated manuscripts from the period almost always show people in bed wearing these caps. Your feet also needed protection from the relentless cold. Few people would dare to sleep with bare feet. They wore thick woolen socks, often knitted by hand. If socks were not available, people wrapped their feet in strips of linen or wool. These were simple but effective foot bindings. Cold feet were a well-known thief of sleep, a constant aching misery to be avoided at all costs. Keeping the extremities warm was a key part of the nightly ritual. The quality of these garments varied greatly with social status. A wealthy lady might wear a nightshirt of fine, imported linen. It could be decorated with delicate embroidery at the collar. Her cap might be made of soft wool. A poor servant in the same castle slept in his only rough tunic. His simple cloak became his final blanket. For the poorest people, there was no difference between day clothes and night clothes. There was only the clothing you had. So you do not truly undress for bed in the medieval world. You strategically dress yourself for a long, cold siege. You add layers of fabric like a soldier putting on armor before a battle. Each piece of clothing has a purpose. Each tie and fold is a small act of preparation. This nightly ritual was a conscious and deliberate process, a methodical preparation for the hours of darkness and vulnerability that lay ahead. This clothing served one other vital purpose. It provided modesty in a world where beds were often shared. Spouses, children, and sometimes even trusted servants occupied the same sleeping space. Being fully clothed was a matter of simple propriety. It maintained social boundaries even in the most intimate of settings. In this way, practicality and social custom were woven together. Your nightclothes kept you both warm and respectable until the morning light returned. Climbing into your carefully prepared bed was an act of bravery. The layers of linen and wool were not warm and inviting. They were stiff with a deep and penetrating cold. The sheets felt like damp slabs of ice against your bare skin. This initial shock could make your body shiver uncontrollably for an hour. It was a miserable start to a long night. Sleep was impossible until your own body could overcome this initial thermal assault. A better way was needed. So a clever tool was invented to fight this freezing welcome. It was called a warming pan. This device was usually made of brass or copper. It had a long wooden handle to keep the user safe from the heat. The pan itself was circular and had a hinged lid. The lid was often pierced with decorative patterns of holes. These holes allowed the heat to escape into the bed. This simple machine was one of the most cherished items in a winter household. A servant would perform the nightly ritual of warming the bed. They would use tongs to fill the pan with hot glowing coals from the hearth. After closing the lid, the servant slid the pan between the sheets and blankets. They moved it back and forth constantly to distribute the heat. A wonderful wave of warmth would spread through the bedding. The damp chill evaporated, replaced by a dry and comforting heat. For a few moments, the bed became a welcoming sanctuary. This ritual, however, was filled with obvious peril. A careless or sleepy servant might leave the pan in one spot for too long. The intense heat would scorch the expensive linen sheets black. Worse still, a stray spark escaping the pan could ignite the straw mattress. The entire bed could burst into flames within moments. A tool meant to provide comfort could bring total disaster. The scent of scorched wool was a common smell in many castle chambers. A humbler and safer solution was available to almost everyone. Smooth stones or heavy bricks were placed near the fire to absorb its heat. They would sit by the hearth for hours until they were almost too hot to touch. These stones were then wrapped carefully in multiple layers of thick cloth. This created a small portable radiator, a simple bundle that held the memory of the fire deep within its core. This method was slow and steady, unlike the fierce heat of the pan. These cloth-wrapped stones were then placed deep in the bed. They were usually put at the very foot of the mattress. They acted like primitive hot water bottles. Their gentle and persistent warmth would last for many hours. The heat would seep slowly into your feet and legs. This small comfort made a huge difference. It fought off the numbness that so often crept up from the cold floor. It was a small but vital anchor of warmth in a cold bed. Sometimes the ritual of warming was also a ritual of scent. Sweet-smelling herbs could be scattered over the hot coals in the pan. Dried lavender or rosemary would release their fragrance in the heat. The aromatic smoke would then perfume the sheets and blankets. The clean scent of the herbs would mingle with the sharp smell of smoke. It helped to mask the other musty odors of the chamber. It was a small luxury, a touch of summer's fragrance in the dead of winter. But all of this manufactured warmth was a fleeting gift. The intense heat from the warming pan vanished quickly once the tool was removed. The bed would feel glorious for 10 minutes before the cold began to creep back in. The stones held their heat for longer, but they too would eventually cool. These tools were not a permanent solution. They were a strategic weapon used to win the first and most important battle. The battle to simply fall asleep. We think of sleep as a private and solitary act today. We close our bedroom door and expect to be alone. This was a rare luxury in the medieval castle. A bed was often a crowded and communal space. To sleep alone was to risk sleeping cold. The darkness was something to be faced together. Solitude was not a comfort, it was a danger. People understood this simple truth deep in their bones. The most reliable source of heat was not a fire or a stone. It was another living body. The simple physics of huddling together was the greatest survival strategy of all. More bodies trapped in a small space under heavy blankets generated a formidable amount of warmth. This was a low-cost and highly effective solution. It was a primal instinct put to practical use every single night. The heat of life itself was the best defense against the cold of the stone. Entire families of servants or guards often shared a single large bed. Parents and children would curl up together under one set of blankets. What they lost in privacy, they gained in essential shared body heat. A child tucked between two adults was far safer from the chill than a child sleeping alone. This closeness was not a matter of sentiment. It was a calculated decision for the survival of the group. The family unit became a small human furnace. Even a great lord was rarely truly alone at night. His most trusted squire might sleep on a pallet at the foot of his master's bed. The squire's presence was for security, but also for warmth. A lady would have her handmaidens sleeping in an adjoining room or even on the floor of her own chamber. While they might not share the same mattress, their collective presence would slightly raise the temperature of the room. Every warm body was a small victory against the cold. But the most beloved bedfellow was often not a human at all. It was the dog. Hounds of all sizes were welcomed onto or into the bed for their incredible warmth. A lady might hold a small perfumed lapdog close to her chest. A knight might let his massive hunting hounds sprawl across his feet. A dog's body temperature is naturally higher than a human's. They were living, breathing hot water bottles that never cooled down. An old saying speaks of a 3-dog night. This meant the cold was so bitter and severe you needed the heat of 3 dogs piled onto your bed just to survive until morning. The phrase perfectly captures the function of these animal companions. 1 dog was for a standard chilly night. 2 dogs meant a serious frost. 3 dogs meant the winter was trying to claim you. The number of dogs was a living thermometer measuring the night's ferocity. This communal warmth certainly came with a price. Fleas and lice could spread with alarming speed between sleepers. Privacy was non-existent. Sharing a bed with animals meant putting up with their smells, their shedding fur, and their movements. A dog might drag the dirt of the courtyard into the bed. It might hide a greasy bone under the covers, but these were considered minor inconveniences. They were a small price to pay for the gift of life-saving warmth. In the end, the greatest defense against the cold was life itself. The combined heat of people and their animals was a powerful and reliable shield. It was a primal warmth, a simple truth that a distant fire could never fully replace. To feel another's breath and heartbeat in the darkness was a profound comfort. It was a reminder that you were not alone in the struggle. Survival in the medieval night was very often a team effort. The stone walls were the great and constant enemy. They were a permanent source of cold. All the blankets and furs in the world could not stop their icy breath from filling a room. The chill radiated from the stone day and night. It was a cold that felt ancient and alive. To survive the castle, you had to find a way to tame the stone itself. You had to build another wall within the walls, a wall made of fabric and air. So people learned to cover the unforgiving stone. They hung huge, woven tapestries from iron hooks driven into the mortar. These were not just pictures of hunts and battles. They were essential shields against the frost. A rich tapestry could cover an entire wall from the ceiling to the floor. Their vibrant colors of red and gold brought a visual warmth to the gray chambers. But their true purpose was far more practical than decorative. The genius of the tapestry was the air it trapped. A tapestry was hung a few inches away from the stone surface. This created a thin and unmoving pocket of air. This trapped air acted as a remarkably effective layer of insulation. It broke the direct connection between the cold stone and the air of the room. A person standing near a tapestry-covered wall felt significantly less chill than one standing near bare stone. It was a simple but brilliant piece of engineering. A richer lord might take this idea a step further. He might panel his private chamber with dark, polished wood. Oak boards were carefully fitted over the cold stone. Wood is a much warmer material, a friendlier surface that does not steal heat so aggressively. A wood-paneled room felt less like a cave and more like a civilized space. It also helped to reduce the dampness that often plagued stone walls. It was an expensive upgrade, but one that offered a real improvement in comfort. The wisest nobles and their families slept in a special room. It was often called the solar. The solar was a smaller private chamber, usually located on an upper floor. Its compact size made it far easier to keep warm with a single fireplace. Unlike the vast Great Hall, the heat in a solar did not immediately vanish. This room often faced south to capture the weak winter sun. It was the true heart of the castle during the coldest months. People also used the sun as a powerful ally. They would often move their sleeping quarters with the seasons. A family might sleep in a cool north-facing room during the hot summer. But in winter, they would relocate their beds and belongings to south-facing chambers. These rooms captured the pale sunlight for a few precious hours each day. This small amount of solar warmth was a welcome gift. It made the mornings slightly less brutal. Like their magnificent beds, nobles often traveled with their favorite tapestries. They were too valuable to be left behind, both in cost and in function. Servants would carefully take them down from the walls. They would be rolled up and packed onto wagons. A familiar tapestry hung in a strange, cold room felt like a piece of home. It was a portable defense system, a way to ensure you always had at least one layer of protection against unfamiliar walls. So the room itself is transformed into part of the defense. The walls are tamed by thick layers of wool and wood. The living space is made smaller, more intimate, and more human. It is still a castle chamber with drafts and shadows, but it is no longer just an empty stone box. It is a space that has been claimed from the cold, a space where the strategies of survival are built into the very architecture of the room. Your room is now a fortress of cloth and wood, but every fortress has its weak points. In your chamber, the windows and the doors are gaping wounds in your defense. These openings are a direct invitation to the winter wind. The cold does not wait for a siege. It is already inside. It pours through these gaps in relentless streams. All your other preparations are meaningless if you cannot secure these vulnerable points. The battle for warmth is often won or lost at the edges of the room. Do not imagine windows made of clear and perfect glass. Glass was an incredibly rare and precious substance in this era. It was a luxury reserved for the grandest cathedrals and the private chapels of kings. Your castle window is something far cruder. It is likely just a narrow vertical slit in the thick stone wall. It is an opening designed for an archer to shoot from, not for a resident to look out of. It is a feature of war, not of domestic life. The main defense for this opening is a pair of heavy oak shutters. They can be barred shut from the inside. When closed, they plunge the room into near total darkness. They block the worst of the wind and keep out the snow, but they do not seal the opening completely. Drafts still knife through the cracks between the planks. The cold air bleeds around the edges of the wooden frame. The shutters are a shield full of holes. To get a little light without the wind, some windows were covered differently. A piece of linen cloth could be soaked in oil or wax. This made the fabric translucent and somewhat waterproof. It would be stretched tight on a wooden frame. This covering allowed a dim, milky light to enter the room. Thinly scraped animal horn could also be used. Many small pieces of horn were fitted together to create a pane that glowed with a dull amber light. The doorways were another major source of terrible drafts. A heavy wooden door did not fit its frame perfectly. Cold air from the corridors and stairwells poured in under it, so a second defense was often used. A thick, heavy curtain of wool or velvet was hung over the inside of the door. This curtain or arras trapped the draft before it could enter the room. It was a simple fabric airlock, a final barrier against the castle's inner chill. This was a constant war, fought over small details. People would use anything they could to plug the remaining gaps. They would stuff old rags or dried moss into every visible crack. They would mix clay with animal dung to create a temporary plaster to seal window frames. It was a desperate and unending task. The wind always found a new way in. The battle against these tiny invading streams of air was fought every single evening. You could always hear the enemy just outside. The wind would whistle a high, thin note as it squeezed through a gap in the shutter. A loose wooden frame would rattle against the stone all night long. The arras over the door would shift and billow with each powerful gust. These sounds were a constant reminder of the cold's pressure, a soundtrack of the siege that nature was laying against your small, warm space. A medieval room was never truly sealed or airtight. That was an impossible dream from a future time. The goal was not to eliminate the drafts. It was simply to reduce their power. Every shutter, every curtain, and every stuffed rag was part of this effort. It was an attempt to make the room's defenses hold, to turn the wind's roar into a manageable whisper, to survive the night's relentless assault until the sun rose once more. The greatest luxury in a noble castle chamber was a private fireplace. This was not the huge roaring hearth of the great hall. It was a smaller stone opening, a personal altar dedicated to warmth. To have your own fire was the ultimate mark of status. It meant you did not have to huddle with the masses below. You could command your own small sun. The mantel was often carved with your family's coat of arms, a statement of power over the cold itself. You pull a heavy chair close to the flames. Your face and hands begin to feel hot and flushed. The warmth is intense, a welcome relief from the room's chill. But your back, which faces the rest of the chamber, remains stubbornly cold. This is the fireplace's great deception. It creates a small bubble of comfort, but its heat is too weak to conquer the entire room. The fire keeps you warm only as long as you pay tribute to it by staying near. This precious fire also came with a terrible and constant companion. Its name was smoke. Medieval chimneys were often just wide and simple shafts. They did not have the clever bends and drafts of modern designs. If the wind blew from the wrong direction, smoke would pour back down the chimney. The room would quickly fill with a thick and choking haze. The fire that was meant to save you now tried to suffocate you. The smoke was a relentless sensory assault. It stung your eyes and made them water constantly. It left a bitter taste of ash on your tongue. A dry, hacking cough would rack your body in the acrid air. Over time, the soot settled everywhere. It blackened the stone above the mantel. It left a greasy film on the bedding and tapestries. Your own hair and clothes would carry the permanent smell of a bonfire. But people endured the smoke. They chose the burning lungs over the frozen limbs. A smoky room was a survivable room, a small price to pay for the gift of life. They learned to sleep through the coughing fits. They wiped soot from their faces in the morning. They accepted the haze as a necessary part of winter. Clean air was a luxury they simply could not afford when the frost was gathering on the walls. Warmth was always the more urgent need. The fire demanded constant attention through the long night. It was not a machine you could simply turn on and forget. You or a servant would have to wake in the darkness every few hours. New logs had to be carefully placed on the embers to keep the flames alive. To let the fire die out was to surrender the room to the cold. This broke the night into small pieces. Sleep was not a long journey, but a series of short naps between moments of vigilance. The fire was much more than just physical heat. Its flickering light was a powerful guardian against the oppressive darkness. It pushed the deep shadows back to the corners of the room. Its soft crackle and pop was a living voice in the dead silence. It felt like a loyal companion, a sleepless watcher. The psychological comfort of the fire was almost as important as its warmth. It made the long hours of the night feel less lonely and less menacing. Towards the gray light of dawn, the fire would finally burn low. The logs would collapse into a bed of glowing embers. They pulsed with a deep and fading red light. As the flames died, the room's profound cold would begin to reclaim its territory. The brief truce was over. The sleeper would stir in their bed, feeling the chill return. This fading glow was a daily reminder, a reminder that their comfort was temporary and their survival was a cycle that must begin anew each evening. The battle against the cold was fought on two separate fronts. The first battle was fought outside the body. It was a war of blankets, fires, and tapestries. The second battle was fought deep inside the body itself. Your own flesh and blood had to become a furnace, and every furnace needs fuel. A full stomach was just as important as a thick woolen cloak. Food was the source of your own personal heat. The evening meal for most castle inhabitants was a simple and heavy affair. It was often a thick stew called pottage. This was a humble dish of boiled grains like barley or oats. It was thickened with whatever vegetables were available. Cabbage, onions, and turnips were common. This pottage sat heavy in the stomach. It provided a slow release of energy that would last for hours. It was a dense and comforting warmth you could carry inside you to bed. A nobleman's supper was a much spicier and richer affair. His pottage might be made with venison or rabbit instead of just vegetables. His cooks would add expensive imported spices to the pot. Ginger, cloves, and peppercorns were not just for flavor. According to medieval medicine, these spices were believed to have heating properties. They were thought to literally warm the blood and fortify the body against the chill. A spicy meal was a form of edible armor. Warm drinks were absolutely essential before attempting to sleep. A cup of heated ale was a common comfort for both servants and lords. It was thick and full of calories. The warm liquid would spread through the chest, a welcome inner fire that relaxed the muscles. It was a simple pleasure that made the prospect of a cold bed slightly less dreadful. Children might be given warm milk, sweetened with a little honey. The wealthy enjoyed more luxurious nightcaps. They drank spiced wine heated gently over the fire. This drink was often called hypocras. It was sweetened with honey and infused with cinnamon and other exotic spices. Another popular drink was the posset. This was hot milk curdled with ale or wine. It was a thick and creamy drink served as a sleepy-time medicine. These beverages were designed to soothe the body and trick it into a warm slumber. Food was seen as a powerful form of medicine. The science of the day was based on the four humors. Winter was a cold and dry season. Therefore, a person needed to eat hot and moist foods to stay in balance. Physicians would prescribe recipes for winter meals. They advised people to eat roasted meats and root vegetables. They warned against eating cool foods like fish or salad in the evening. Your last meal of the day was a medical prescription. Imagine yourself now sitting by the great hall's fire with a full stomach. The warmth from your meal makes your eyelids feel heavy. The spiced wine has relaxed your limbs. For a brief moment you feel strong and content. You feel fortified enough to finally face the cold chamber that waits for you above. This feeling of inner warmth was a crucial psychological shield. It gave you the courage to begin the nightly journey into the cold. But this inner fire needed constant fuel to keep burning. Your body would spend the entire night burning the calories from your supper. It was fighting a long and desperate battle to maintain its core temperature. By the first light of dawn, the fuel would be nearly gone. You would often wake up not just cold, but also hollow with hunger. This made the medieval morning feel especially harsh. The fragile warmth you had built inside you had been spent. The fight for survival through the night was not only physical. The long hours of darkness were a time of great spiritual danger. The cold itself felt like more than just weather. It felt like a living and malevolent force. The medieval mind saw the world as a battleground between good and evil, and the night was when the forces of darkness held the most power. To go to sleep was to make yourself vulnerable to these unseen enemies. So people armed themselves with faith and prayer. The day would often end with the household gathering for evening prayers. Individuals would whisper their own pleas for protection at their bedside. These were not just words of habit, they were a shield against the terrors of the dark. A request for God and His angels to stand guard over the household. A way to find peace before entering the uncertain state of sleep. Physical objects were also used for powerful spiritual defense. A simple wooden cross might hang from the bedpost. A small pouch containing a saint's relic could be tucked under the pillow. These were not just symbols, they were seen as active spiritual weapons. They were believed to radiate a holy power that could repel demons and evil spirits. An amulet was a piece of spiritual armor, a silent guardian watching over you as you slept. Alongside the church's teachings were much older folk beliefs. A knife or a piece of iron hidden under the straw mattress was thought to repel malicious fairies. Sprigs of herbs, like juniper or rowan, were hung over the door. These were believed to purify the dangerous night air. Many people held both Christian and pagan beliefs at the same time. They would use any weapon they could find in the Great War against the darkness. The darkness itself was an enemy we can barely imagine today. Without streetlights or electricity, the night was absolute. It was a thick and heavy blackness that swallowed all light. The only illumination came from the dying fire or a single sputtering candle. In this profound void, every strange sound became magnified. The creak of a floorboard or the scuttling of a rat could sound like something monstrous. People genuinely feared the creatures of the night. They told stories of demons that could slip through keyholes. They believed a spirit called the night hag could sit on a sleeper's chest. This would cause terrifying nightmares and the feeling of suffocation. The physical weight of heavy blankets on your body could icily feel like this demon's oppressive presence. The line between a bad dream and a spiritual attack was very thin. The final moments before sleep were a careful and deliberate ritual. You would bar the wooden shutter one last time. You would pull the heavy bed curtains completely shut. You would whisper a final prayer into the enclosed darkness, and you would make the sign of the cross over your body. Each of these actions was a layer of protection, a methodical sealing of your small world against the vast and dangerous night outside. When all the physical preparations were complete, you were left with your faith. This belief was a final, invisible blanket. It was a warmth for the soul, a promise that you were not truly alone in the long dark. For the medieval sleeper, trust in God was the ultimate survival tool. It was the one piece of armor that could not be stripped away by the cold or the wind. It was the quiet hope that carried them through the darkness until the safety of dawn. We measure a good night's rest by its continuity. We see a full night of sleep as a single solid block. 8 hours of uninterrupted slumber is our modern ideal. A person who wakes in the night is said to have a problem. The medieval sleeper lived by a very different and forgotten rhythm. Their journey through the darkness was not a single voyage. It was broken into 2 distinct parts. A night was not something to be conquered in one go. People would go to bed early, not long after the sun went down. There was little to do in the expensive darkness. They would fall into a deep slumber for several hours. This first part of the night's rest was known as the first sleep. It would last until sometime after midnight. This was a time for the body to recover from the day's hard labor. Then, around the middle of the night, they would naturally and gently wake up. This was not seen as a disorder like insomnia. It was a normal and expected part of the nightly cycle. This period of quiet wakefulness could last for an hour or even longer. The castle would be in a state of profound silence. It was a strange and unique time. This waking time often had a vital and practical purpose. Someone had to get up and tend to the chamber's fire. The logs that had been burning since evening would now be mostly embers. New wood had to be placed on the hearth, a crucial act to keep the deep cold at bay. To neglect this duty was to risk waking up in a truly frozen room. This was also a time for quiet and personal activities. People would use this interval to pray or for peaceful reflection. A husband and wife might have a soft and intimate conversation. A scholar might read a page from a book by candlelight. Some medical texts even recommended this time for marital relations. It was a calm and private hour, a moment of peace that did not exist during the busy day. But leaving the warm sanctuary of the bed was a shock to the system. The air in the chamber was intensely and painfully cold. The short journey from the bed curtains to the hearth was a shivering trial. Your feet would ache on the icy rushes. Your breath would plume in the air. This brief exposure to the room's true temperature was a harsh reminder. After an hour or so of wakefulness, people would feel tired again. They would return to the relative warmth of their bed. They would then fall into their second sleep. This second slumber was often lighter than the first. It was a time of dreams and shifting rest. This second sleep would last until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the shutters. This pattern perfectly filled the long hours of a medieval winter night. So the medieval night was not a blank and empty space. It was a landscape with its own distinct geography. It had a first sleep, a period of quiet watchfulness, and a second sleep. This rhythm was not a choice. It was dictated by the natural cycles of the human body, and it was reinforced by the demands of a world without electric light, a world where the darkness was long and the fire was always hungry. The medieval night was never truly silent. Our modern world is filled with the constant hum of machines. The castle night was filled with a different and more organic kind of noise. It was a symphony of natural and human sounds, a complex language that the inhabitants learned to read. To lie awake in the darkness was to listen to the castle itself telling the story of the night. Sleep did not offer an escape from this world. It was a deep immersion within it. The wind was the castle's true and constant voice. It moaned low and long as it rolled across the open battlements. It shrieked with a high, thin whistle through the narrow arrow slits. It would grab a loose wooden shutter and rattle it against the stone frame. The sound was a perpetual reminder of the cold's desire to get inside. The great stone structure of the castle groaned under the winter's weight. Ancient roof timbers would creak and pop under a heavy layer of frost. In a sudden thaw, water would drip with a hollow, lonely echo in a distant passage. The very stones seemed to shift and settle in the deep cold. The building was not a dead thing. You would hear the faint sounds of life all around you. The crunch of a guard's boots on the snowy courtyard below. The distant cough of another soldier on his lonely patrol. A dog, dreaming by the fire, might whimper or twitch its legs. The snores from a servant's pallet on the floor would rise and fall in a steady rhythm. These small sounds were comforting. They were proof that you were not alone in the vast and sleeping fortress. The air you breathed was a thick and complex tapestry of smells. Wood smoke was the strongest thread in this tapestry, of course. It was a sharp and pervasive scent that clung to everything. But underneath it was the damp, earthy smell of the stone itself, like a cellar or a cave. There was the musty scent of old straw and decaying rushes on the floor, and the faint, lingering odor of roasted meat from the evening's meal in the great hall. The more intimate smells came from your own bed, the oily scent of lanolin from your heavy wool blanket, the slightly sour smell of linen that was not fully dry, the musky animal odor of the fur coverlet and the dog sleeping at your feet, and the inescapable human smells of sweat and stale breath. To breathe in the medieval night was to take in a rich and unfiltered picture of the world you lived in. These sounds and smells were more than just background noise. They were a form of vital information. A sudden silence from the dogs in the courtyard could be a sign of alarm. The smell of burning cloth was a clear signal of danger. A change in the pitch of the wind's whistle meant a storm was coming. So you did not sleep in a peaceful and silent void. You slept in the belly of a living and breathing beast. Its groans and smells and sighs were the constant companions of your slumber. This rich sensory world shaped your dreams. It informed your waking moments in the deep of the night. The castle was not a quiet refuge from the world. It was a concentrated and echoing version of it. It was a resource that was distributed unevenly. It flowed upward to the powerful, just like coin and land. Your rank in the complex social hierarchy determined exactly how cold you were at night. Not everyone shivered equally. The nightly battle against the frost was fought on very different terms. Your bed and your blankets were a direct reflection of your station in life. The lord and his lady slept at the absolute peak of this pyramid of comfort. Their private solar chamber was a fortress of warmth. It had the best-built fireplace and the thickest tapestries. They slept on a mountain of feathers and fur. Servants were tasked with keeping their fire lit all night long. Their comfort was a matter of state. A cold and sleepless lord was a poor ruler. His rest was protected as a valuable asset of the castle. The servants and laborers slept at the very bottom of this pyramid. They huddled together on simple straw pallets. They were often crammed into small, windowless rooms in the castle's towers or cellars. Sometimes they slept on the floor of the very kitchens they worked in. They had no privacy and few blankets. Their sleep was the heavy slumber of the exhausted, a brief escape before another day of hard work in the service of their master. But the servants had a secret and surprising advantage. Their small, crowded rooms were much easier to heat with body warmth alone. 10 bodies in a tiny room could create a surprisingly cozy atmosphere. The vast chamber of a lord could feel much colder, a lonely and grand prison of ice. The lord had luxury on his side. The servants had the simple and effective physics of community on theirs. Sometimes the humblest corner was the warmest. The soldiers of the garrison had a different experience entirely. They slept in long communal barrack halls. Their beds were simple wooden cots or pallets laid out in neat rows. Their warmth came from discipline and close quarters. They slept side by side with their cloaks for extra blankets. Their sleep was functional and often light. They had to be ready to wake at a moment's notice to the sound of an alarm bell. A guest's treatment for the night clearly revealed their social standing. An important visitor, like another noble, would be given a private chamber. They would receive the full honors of a warming pan and extra candles. A lesser guest, like a traveling merchant, might have to share a bed with a stranger. An unwelcome visitor might be offered a space on a bench in the drafty great hall. A bed was a tool of diplomacy. The warmest and most coveted places in the castle were not the noble chambers. They were the working heart of the fortress. The kitchens, with their great cooking fires that burned for hours, were wonderfully warm. The bakehouse was even better. The massive bread ovens would radiate a deep and gentle heat all night long. To be allowed to sleep on the floor near the ovens was a true luxury, a privilege granted only to a favored few among the servants. So the castle at night was a living map of power and privilege. You could trace the lines of the social order by degrees of temperature. Warmth was status, and the cold was a constant and physical reminder of your place in the world. The lord enjoyed his private fire. The servants shared their body heat. The baker's boy slept in the glow of the oven. Each person found their own unique solution in the great and unequal struggle to simply stay warm until morning. The winter cold was not an equal opportunity enemy. It preyed upon the weakest members of the castle household. The very young and the very old were its favorite targets. A healthy adult could shiver through the night and recover, but a frail body could be pushed past its limit by the relentless chill. Protecting the most vulnerable was a sacred and constant duty. Their survival was a measure of the entire community's strength. The children of a noble were carefully guarded from the night's dangers. They rarely slept in cold, isolated chambers. They were often grouped together in a nursery. This room was usually located in a warmer part of the castle. A trusted and experienced nursemaid would sleep in the room with them. Her most important job was to keep their small fireplace burning brightly and safely through all the hours of darkness. A newborn infant was protected by a special practice. It was called swaddling. The baby would be wrapped from neck to toe in tight bands of linen cloth. This turned the infant into a tiny and secure bundle. This was thought to help their limbs grow straight, but it also created a perfect pocket of insulation. The baby's own body heat was trapped inside the wrappings. It was their first armor against the world's cold. The children of servants had a different but equally effective kind of protection. They did not have a private nursery or a dedicated nurse. Their safety came from simple closeness. They slept pressed tightly between their parents and their siblings in a shared family bed. A child's small body was sandwiched between the larger, warmer bodies of adults. This direct contact was a powerful and constant source of life-saving heat. The elderly faced the same mortal danger from the other end of life's journey. Their bodies could no longer produce heat as easily as they once did. Their circulation was often poor. They felt the cold in their bones in a way a young person could not understand. So they were given the place of honor by the fire, a position of both respect and practical warmth. To be old was to have earned the right to the best spot. An aging grandparent would receive special comforts. They might be given an extra fur blanket from the Lord's own collection. A servant would be tasked with placing a hot-wrapped stone at their feet each night. They were brought cups of warm, spiced wine to drink before bed. These small comforts were a vital sign of respect. They showed that a person's value did not diminish with their physical strength. For the very frail, the night was a time of genuine and quiet fear. To fall asleep in the deep cold was a profound act of trust. They would whisper extra prayers for survival. They prayed that God would grant them the strength to see another morning. The morning light was not just the start of a new day. It was a confirmation of victory, a sign that they had endured one more night's siege. So the care of the weak was a measure of the household's soul. It was a communal and shared responsibility. Keeping a child warm was every person's duty. The comfort of an elder was a reflection of the Lord's own piety. The entire castle, in its own way, shared in the small victory of a peaceful dawn. When the old and the young awoke safe and warm, the whole community had succeeded. The coldest part of the long night was just before the dawn. The chamber fire had shrunk to a few dying embers. Its warmth was now a faint and fading memory. The room had surrendered completely to the winter's chill. All the heat that had been so carefully built up the night before was gone. This was the moment of maximum cold, the moment of maximum vulnerability. Waking up was not a gentle process. It was a brutal return to a frozen reality. To open your eyes in this moment was a special kind of misery. Your bed was the only warm place in the entire known world. The cocoon of blankets and body heat was a precious and fragile sanctuary. The thought of leaving it was a form of torture. To swing your feet out from under the covers felt like jumping into a frozen lake. Every instinct in your body screamed at you to stay put, to hide from the world for just a little longer. Your first breath of the morning air was a painful physical shock. It felt like swallowing a lungful of tiny ice needles. The cold would sting the back of your throat. A thick white cloud would erupt from your lips with every exhale. This visible breath was a constant reminder of the room's hostility. The air itself felt like an enemy you had to breathe just to stay alive. A noble lord had a great advantage in this morning battle. He did not have to be the first one to suffer. A servant would enter his cold chamber while the master was still in bed. The servant's shivering hands would clear the ash from the hearth. They would add new kindling and gently blow the embers back to life. The servant endured the worst of the cold, so that their lord could wake to the sound of a crackling fire. You dressed yourself with desperate and fumbling speed. There was no time for careful grooming. Your woolen tunic felt cold and stiff against your skin. Sometimes it was even damp from the room's condensation. You pulled it on quickly, a hasty suit of armor against the room's hostile air. Every second of exposed skin was a small agony. The goal was to cover yourself as fast as possible. You turn to the small table that holds the wash basin. You intend to splash some water on your face to wake yourself up, but the water inside the ceramic bowl is a solid block of ice. A smooth and glassy surface reflects the room's gray light. You have to crack it with your fist or a small tool. You can then scoop up a few freezing drops for a brisk and painful wash. This was a daily morning reality. Once you were finally dressed, there was only one immediate goal. You had to get to the nearest large fire as quickly as possible. You would hurry out of your chamber and down the cold stone corridors. You would make your way to the great hall. The servants there would be building up the huge morning blaze. You would stand as close as you could to the flames. You would stand there until the feeling returned to your hands and feet. Then the first light of the sun would finally appear. It was a thin and watery light that crept through the shutters. It had very little warmth in it, but it was a powerful symbol of survival, a sign that you had won another long battle against the night. The darkness was defeated. The sun had returned. You were cold and tired and hungry, but you were alive, and the whole daily cycle of survival could now begin again. This endless war against the cold took a heavy and lasting toll. It was not a battle you could fight every night without scars. The winter left its mark on the bodies of everyone in the castle. To survive the night was one thing. To survive the season was another. The constant stress of being cold and damp was a form of slow damage, a grinding process that wore down even the strongest constitution. A deep and persistent ache would settle into your bones. The damp chill that radiated from the stone walls seemed to seep into your very marrow. It would inflame the joints, causing stiffness and pain. People would wake up feeling old and sore, their bodies creaking like the castle's ancient timbers. For those who already suffered from ailments like arthritis, winter was a season of unending misery. The dampness was a physical presence in their bodies. The skin on your hands and feet would suffer terribly. Painful red and itching swellings, called chilblains, were a common misery. They were caused by the constant cycle of cold and rewarming. They made wearing boots or holding a tool an agonizing task. A guard on the night watch faced an even deadlier threat. He risked the black deadening bite of true frostbite, an enemy that could cost him his fingers or his toes. The air itself was a constant enemy to the lungs. It was a harsh combination of icy dampness and thick wood smoke. Breathing this air day and night was incredibly damaging. A deep, rattling cough was the constant soundtrack of a medieval winter. People spat thick phlegm into the rushes on the floor. Respiratory sickness was rampant. The very fire that kept you from freezing also poisoned the air you needed to live. Medieval doctors had a theory for all this winter suffering. They believed the body was governed by 4 humors. The winter's cold and dampness caused an excess of the humor called phlegm. This was a cold and moist substance. It was believed to be the root cause of winter sickness. An excess of phlegm made the body sluggish and vulnerable. Your personal health was a battle to keep your humors in balance. So all the medical treatments for winter ailments were about heat. The goal was to fight the cold phlegm with its opposite. Aching joints were rubbed with hot poultices made of mustard or pepper. Doctors would prescribe hot and dry foods. You would drink hot spiced wine to burn the coldness out of your chest. The cures were a direct and simple reflection of the problem. You fought the cold with fire both outside and inside the body. The constant physical discomfort was also emotionally draining. The endless gray skies and the perpetual feeling of being cold could bring a deep weariness to the soul. This was a sickness of the spirit, a melancholy born of the long dark season. The lack of sunlight and the oppressive atmosphere of the smoky castle could make a person feel hopeless. Winter was a psychological siege as much as a physical one. And yet people endured all of these hardships with a stoic resilience. They accepted a certain amount of winter pain and sickness as normal. It was an unavoidable part of the cycle of the year. Their bodies were hardened and tough in a way we can hardly imagine today. They did not expect perfect comfort. They expected survival. This incredible hardiness was perhaps the most effective medicine of all. The seasons turn, and the long winter finally releases its grip. The sun returns to warm the land. The castle's greatest enemy in the winter now becomes its most trusted friend. The massive stone walls that tormented you with their endless chill now offer a blessed relief. The great fortress that was a tomb of ice in January becomes a cool and shady haven in July. The nature of the battle has completely reversed. To step into the great hall from the blazing summer sun was a small miracle. The air inside was instantly and wonderfully cool. It was like entering a cave on a hot day. The thick stone had held the memory of winter's chill, a welcome gift in the sweltering heat. The same walls that radiated cold now radiated a natural coolness. For a few months of the year, the castle's greatest flaw became its greatest strength. The bedchamber is completely transformed. The heavy fur and wool blankets are gone. They have been beaten clean and packed away in great wooden chests with dried herbs to keep the moths away. The bed is now dressed with only a single light linen sheet. The thick bed curtains have been taken down or are tied permanently back to the posts. The goal is no longer to trap heat, but to encourage the slightest movement of air. The heavy wooden shutters are thrown wide open. Bright sunlight streams into the room, chasing the old shadows away. The room is filled with the sounds and smells of summer. You can hear the drone of bees in the castle garden below. The cheerful noise of people working in the courtyard drifts up to you. The air smells of cut grass and flowers instead of smoke and damp wool. The world has come alive again. But the summer was not a perfect paradise. On a humid day, the cool stone would sweat with condensation. The walls would feel slick and damp to the touch. The air could feel heavy and clammy, a different kind of unpleasant chill. The rushes on the floor could quickly begin to smell of mildew in the damp air. The castle's relationship with moisture was a problem in every season. The open windows also invited a new army of tiny invaders. Swarms of flies would buzz in lazy circles around the room. They would land on your food and on your face. At night, the whine of a mosquito in your ear was a maddening torment. The warmth also brought out the rats and mice in greater numbers. Sleep in the summer meant sharing your bed with a host of unwelcome and biting guests. People would chase the breeze in summer just as they chased the sun in winter. They would move their sleeping quarters to cooler, north-facing rooms if they could. They sought out chambers that had a good cross breeze. On the very hottest nights, some people would abandon their rooms altogether. They might take a simple pallet and sleep outside on the roof or on the stone battlements to catch the night wind. Summer in the castle was a time of truce. The daily, desperate war for simple survival was mostly over. Sleep was no longer a battle against a life-threatening enemy. It was a peaceful surrender to the warm and gentle night. The great stone beast had been temporarily tamed by the sun, and for a few precious months, rest could be something you enjoyed, not just something you endured. Imagine you are a traveler at the end of a long and weary day. The sun is setting behind you. Ahead looms the dark and imposing shape of a strange castle. This is not your home. You do not know the people inside its walls. You are seeking shelter for the night. The warmth and comfort you take for granted in your own bed are now an uncertain hope. The night ahead is a mystery, a test of your host's generosity and your own resilience. Hospitality was a sacred and serious duty in the medieval age. To refuse a traveler shelter at night was a deep sin. It was a failure of a lord's Christian and noble obligations. But the quality of that shelter was a different matter entirely. A castle would always open its gates to a legitimate traveler. But the kind of bed you received depended entirely on who you were. Your welcome was a precise measure of your importance. A noble guest would be treated with the greatest honor. He would be greeted at the gate by the Lord himself. He would feast at the high table in the great hall. Afterwards, he would be led to a private guest chamber, the best the castle had to offer. A servant would be assigned to him to tend his fire. He would sleep in a fine bed with clean linen and fur blankets. His comfort was a reflection of his host's own status. A simple merchant or a royal messenger would receive a much lesser welcome. He would eat well enough at the lower tables, but his sleeping arrangements would be an afterthought. He would not be given a private chamber. His bed would be a simple straw pallet in a noisy room. He might have to share that room with the lord's squires or senior servants. He was a temporary guest in a world not built for his comfort. Sometimes you would be forced to share a bed with a complete stranger. This was a common practice in crowded inns and castles. You would lie down side by side under the same rough blanket. You would feel the warmth of their unknown body next to yours. You would hear their snores and smell the ale on their breath. It was an awkward and enforced intimacy, a necessary sacrifice of privacy for the simple gift of warmth. A wise and experienced traveler never trusted his host completely. He came prepared for the worst. He carried his own heavy wool cloak. This versatile garment served as his coat by day and his personal blanket by night. Some wealthy travelers even carried their own fur linings, or a small linen pillow stuffed with soft down. A smart traveler carried a piece of his own comfort with him. He did not leave his survival entirely in the hands of strangers. The poorest pilgrim received the humblest welcome of all. He would be given food and a place out of the wind, but his bed would be the floor of the great hall. The cold rushes would be his mattress, the dying embers of the main fire his only comfort. He would use his traveling sack as a pillow. He would lie there among the sleeping dogs and the snoring servants. He was grateful for any shelter, no matter how crude. So the bed you were given as a guest was a powerful and unspoken message. It told you exactly what your host thought of you. It was a clear and physical expression of your social rank. The long and cold night in an unfamiliar castle was a constant negotiation, a test of your status and your endurance. Your sleep was a public statement about your place in the complicated medieval world. We often think of the Middle Ages as a simple and ignorant time. We picture a world without science, without progress, and without technology. This is a profound and fundamental mistake. Medieval people were not ignorant. They were incredibly resourceful. Their entire world was a laboratory for practical problem solving, and their solutions for staying warm were a form of brilliant and hands-on technology. Their understanding of textiles was a kind of high technology for the age. Weavers were masters of their craft. They knew how to create woolen cloth that was incredibly dense and heavy. A special process called fulling involved beating the wet wool. This matted the fibers together, creating a fabric that was much thicker and almost windproof. This was not just cloth, it was engineered thermal material. Their method of layering bedding was a deliberate and practical science. They understood the principle of trapped air insulation. They knew that several layers would keep a person warmer than one single thick layer, a function that contributed to the whole system's success. The architecture of the castle also showed a clever and developing ingenuity. A small private solar chamber was a piece of thermal engineering. It was a room designed to be heated more efficiently than a large open hall. The placement of a fireplace or a window was a strategic decision. The use of a tapestry to create an insulating air gap was a brilliant architectural hack. They were slowly learning to build for comfort, not just for war. Their use of food was a kind of practical and applied chemistry. They did not know about calories, but they absolutely knew that fatty and hearty foods provided the fuel needed to stay warm. Their medical theories about hot and cold foods were a complete system, a system designed to manage the body's internal furnace. Their spiced wines and herbal drinks were prescriptions, carefully designed to create internal heat. The great four-poster bed was a brilliant and effective machine. It was a self-contained device for creating a personal microclimate. Its heavy wooden canopy and thick woolen curtains were the key components. You were activating a piece of personal climate control technology, a technology assembled from simple wood and cloth. This deep and practical knowledge was not found in scientific textbooks. It was passed down from one generation to the next. A mother taught her daughter the correct way to layer a bed. A master builder taught his apprentice the best place to build a chimney. It was a living and evolving tradition of survival skills, a chain of wisdom stretching back for centuries, knowledge that was proven true every single winter night. So the true genius of medieval people was their incredible resourcefulness. They built complex and effective survival systems from the simplest of materials. They used wood, wool, and stone. They used herbs, straw, and animal skins. Their technology was not one of wires and circuits. It was a technology of craft, observation, and deep, practical wisdom. A wisdom that allowed them to live and sleep in places we would find completely uninhabitable. The warmth and comfort of a noble's chamber was not magic. It was the product of constant and relentless human labor. Behind every comfortable lord stood a line of cold and tired servants. They were the unseen engine that powered the entire system of survival. Their work was the invisible foundation upon which all the luxury rested. Without their endless effort, the grandest castle would have been a freezing and uninhabitable tomb. The great fireplaces were hungry beasts that never truly slept. They demanded a constant supply of fuel. All day long, servants and peasants would work to feed them. They would cut wood in the frozen forests. The simple act of keeping the fires fed was a monumental and exhausting task. In the evening, a chamber servant's work would intensify. They were responsible for creating a perfect haven for their master. They would build the fire in the private chamber, laying the logs just so. They used the long-handled warming pan with careful hands, a delicate and risky task. They would turn down the sheets and draw the heavy bed curtains. They were the stage managers of a nightly performance of comfort. The servant's duty did not end when their master went to bed. A young page or a trusted squire often slept on a simple pallet on the floor of his lord's room. His sleep was light and watchful. He would wake in the cold darkness several times a night. He would silently rise and add another log to the fire. He was a human thermostat, a living guardian of the flame. The Lord's uninterrupted sleep was his primary responsibility. When their own time for sleep finally came, it was a poor and brief affair. The servants would retreat from the warm, noble chambers. They went to a cold attic or a crowded corner by a smoky kitchen. Their bed was a pile of straw on the floor. Their blanket was a single thin and threadbare cloth. They created all the comfort of the castle, but they were allowed to share in almost none of it. Their own warmth came from huddling together in the dark. The servants also faced the greatest dangers of the night. They worked closest to the open flames. A sudden spark from the hearth could ignite their simple clothing. They were the ones who had to manage the smoky and unpredictable chimneys. They were the first to smell the dangerous scent of a building fire. The relationship between master and servant was a complex one. A servant's life and safety depended on the smooth running of the household. A well-managed castle was a secure home, but they must have felt a quiet and unspoken bitterness. They watched their masters sleep under mountains of fur. So the luxury of the very few was built on the hardship of the many. A lord's peaceful and warm night's sleep was a direct result of a servant's sleepless vigilance. A lady's soft feather bed was made possible by the aching backs of her maids. Warmth was the ultimate and most visible expression of power and inequality. It was a privilege you enjoyed, not something you created for yourself. Life in the cold lands of medieval Europe was a life wrapped in wool. This single remarkable material was the absolute cornerstone of winter survival. It clothed the people from the king down to the lowest peasant. It furnished their castles in the form of blankets and tapestries. The entire economy of many nations was built on the backs of sheep. To understand the medieval world, you must first understand its deep and total reliance on wool. Wool had properties that seemed almost magical to the people of the time. It is a fantastic natural insulator. Its fibers trap millions of tiny pockets of air, creating a barrier against the cold. Crucially, wool can keep you warm even when it is damp. This was a vital quality in the drafty and often wet conditions of a castle. It was also incredibly durable. A good woolen garment could last a lifetime. It was a true miracle fabric. People dressed in a system of layers during the cold winter days. The layer next to the skin was usually a simple linen shirt or tunic. Over that came a long and heavy tunic made of thick wool, and the final outer shell was a great cloak or mantle also made of wool. This system of layering was the key to managing temperature. You could add or remove a layer as you moved from a cold corridor to a warm fireside. The cloak was the most essential and versatile garment a person could own. It was a coat, a blanket, and a portable shelter, all in one. At night, it often served as a person's only blanket. A man's life very often depended on the quality and thickness of his cloak. Fur was used to add an extra layer of targeted protection to these clothes. A wealthy lord's cloak would often be lined with soft and dense fur at the collar and cuffs. This was not just for show, it was a tactical defense against the cold. The fur lining sealed the vulnerable gaps at the neck and wrists where icy drafts could enter. Even a less wealthy person might use a strip of rabbit fur to protect their neck. Clothing and textiles were a primary form of personal wealth. Fine fabrics were incredibly expensive and labor-intensive to produce. A noble's wardrobe was one of his most valuable assets. To own many layers of fine woolen cloth was a greater and more practical sign of status than a bag of gold coins. Your wealth was something you wore on your back. The line between day clothes and night clothes was often very thin or non-existent. You would frequently sleep in the same woolen tunic you had worn all day. You might remove your wet boots and your heavy outer cloak, but the inner layers stayed on. This was a practical choice. The warmth of your body was already trapped within the fibers of the cloth. To take it off would be to waste that precious accumulated heat. So this was a culture built entirely on the principle of insulation. People wrapped their bodies in layers of wool. The nightly rituals of the bedchamber were just the final expression of a way of life. A life that was lived from birth to death inside a protective cocoon of fabric. We have a common picture of medieval people as being incredibly dirty. We imagine a world of grime and filth without any washing. The truth is much more subtle and complicated than that. People in the Middle Ages valued cleanliness. They simply had a very different understanding of it. And they lived in a world where achieving cleanliness, especially in winter, was an enormous and difficult challenge. A hot bath in a cold castle was a monumental effort. It was a major logistical operation. Then the hot water had to be carried back up to the Lord's chamber. The entire process could take hours and require the labor of several people. So a full and luxurious bath was a rare and special event. A large wooden tub would be brought into their chamber and placed near the fire. It was often lined with a cloth to prevent splinters. The water would be scented with herbs and flowers. But this was not a daily or even a weekly habit. It was a treat, a celebration, or a preparation for a special occasion. The normal morning routine was a much simpler and colder affair. It involved a quick wash of the hands and face. The water was from a ceramic basin sitting on a small table. A servant would pour the water for their master. And as we have seen in winter, this water was often numbingly cold. This brisk wash was more of a ritual to wake you up. It was not about deep cleaning the body. The greatest enemy of hygiene was the castle's constant dampness. Nothing ever seemed to fully dry in the cold and humid air. To wash your hair in the middle of winter was a risky decision. It would stay damp for hours, inviting a serious chill that could lead to sickness. Clothes that were washed took days to dry, even when hung near a fire. This reality discouraged frequent and extensive bathing. Being dry was often more important than being clean. People carried the authentic sense of their world with them. The sharp smell of wood smoke was always in their hair and clothes. The earthy smell of horses and leather clung to the men. The human scent of sweat was a normal part of life. The wealthy used strong perfumes and fragrant pomanders to mask these odors. The most important tool for personal hygiene was the linen undergarment. People believed that the linen fabric had a special property. They thought it would absorb the sweat and pull the dirt away from their skin. To them, changing your linen chemise or shirt was a primary form of cleaning. A wealthy person would own many linen undergarments and change them frequently. A clean shirt was almost as good as taking a bath. So medieval people were not dirty by their own unique standards. They were simply being practical. Their idea of cleanliness was shaped by the world they lived in. We picture the castle's great lord living in the highest room of the tallest tower. It is a romantic and powerful image of seclusion and command. We imagine him looking out over his lands from this lofty perch. The reality of life in that tower, especially on a winter's night, was anything but romantic. The very features that made the tower a symbol of power also made it an incredibly cold and miserable place to sleep. The highest rooms in the castle were the most brutally exposed to the winter winds. The wind would attack the stone from all sides without mercy. There was no shelter from its force, no nearby hill or forest to break its relentless assault. The wind would scour every inch of the stonework. It would strip away any tiny pocket of warmth that tried to cling to the walls. To live in the tower was to live in the full and constant blast of the storm. The tower fireplace was often the worst and most inefficient in the entire castle. It would suck the heat from the fire and pull it straight out into the sky. On a windy night, the effect was even worse. Powerful gusts could blow back down the chimney. This would send clouds of smoke and ash billowing out into the room. The journey to your tower bed was a long and lonely ascent. You climbed a narrow spiral staircase ever upward. The stones were often slick with dampness. With each step, you left the communal life of the castle further behind. The sounds of the great hall would fade away. The air would grow colder and colder. The journey itself was a preparation for the isolation that awaited you at the top. So the tower room was a kind of honorable and gilded prison. It was an undeniable sign of your high status. Only the lord and his family would occupy these chambers. But it was also a box of cold stone and howling wind. The privacy it offered came at the terrible price of comfort. In the depths of winter, a servant sleeping by the kitchen ovens was living in far greater luxury than the master of the castle in his grand tower. The sounds of the night were different and more intense up here. The wind did not just moan, it shrieked. It was a high and lonely sound that never stopped. You could hear the sharp tapping of sleet or hail hitting the stone just inches from your head. The comforting human sounds of the castle below were faint and distant. You were alone with the raw and untamed voice of the storm. This environment created a feeling of profound and sometimes terrifying isolation. You felt suspended between the dark, quiet earth below and the violent, raging sky above. It was a place that could make a person feel very small and very vulnerable. The stone walls were thick, but they felt like a fragile shell against the immense power of the winter night. This was a place for a warrior, not for a comfortable sleeper. The tower or keep was the castle's strongest point in a military siege, but it was the weakest and most vulnerable point in the daily war against winter. The lord of the castle, in his high and mighty chamber, often slept the coldest of all. His elevated status offered him no protection from the simple physics of the wind and cold. His power could command armies, but it could not command the winter storm to be quiet. We have visited the great lord in his high and windy tower. Now we must descend. We will travel down from the castle's lofty peaks into its dark and forgotten roots. We go down the winding stairs, past the main floors, down into the cellars, the storerooms, and the dungeons below. This is the underbelly of the castle, a place of deep cold and profound darkness, a world away from the firelit chambers above. The cold down here is a different kind of enemy. It is not the sharp and screaming cold of the wind. It is a deep and heavy cold, the permanent chill of the damp earth itself. The stone walls are buried underground. They are in constant contact with the frozen soil of winter. This earthly cold seeps into the very bones of the castle. It is a damp and motionless cold, a cold that feels ancient and inescapable. Imagine a prisoner huddled in a lightless dungeon cell. His bed is a small pile of wet and rotting straw. His only blanket is a single thin piece of ragged cloth. He has no fire. He has no candle. He has no companion but the cold stone and the darkness. His sleep is a shallow and shivering state, a desperate attempt to conserve the tiny spark of his own body heat against the overwhelming power of the earth. Water constantly weeps from the sweating stone walls. It forms dark puddles on the uneven and filthy floor. The air is thick with the smell of mold and decay. The prisoner's straw bedding is perpetually damp. It offers almost no insulation. It clings to his body with a clammy and chilling touch. To sleep in such conditions was a slow and deliberate form of torture, a nightly battle against sickness and despair. The very lowest ranking servants sometimes slept in these cellar spaces. They would find a corner among the great barrels of wine and the heavy sacks of flour. They were out of the wind, but they were still deep in the damp and the cold. They would make their beds on the floor. They shared their sleeping quarters with the spiders and the rats. Theirs was a life lived in the shadows, both day and night. There were no windows in these deep and buried places. There were no fireplaces. The only light might come from a servant's torch passing in the corridor. The only warmth came from their own bodies, huddled together for survival in the near total darkness. When the last torch was gone, the blackness was absolute, a thick and suffocating void where the sense of sight was completely useless. The sounds in these deep places were the sounds of a living tomb, the slow and steady drip of water from a vaulted ceiling, the frantic scratching and scuttling of rats in a forgotten corner, the faint and muffled echoes of the living world far above, the sound of a slammed door or a distant shout would arrive as a mere ghost of a vibration through the stone. It was a world that felt completely cut off from life. So the tower and the dungeon were the two opposite poles of suffering. They were two different kinds of winter hell. The tower was a hell of wind and violent exposure. The dungeon was a hell of damp and suffocating darkness. One was a place of high and lonely status. The other was a place of low and forgotten misery. But in both places, sleep was not a rest. It was a brutal and punishing ordeal. Every great castle had a sacred space at its spiritual heart. The chapel was often the most beautiful and ornate room of all. Its walls might be covered in colorful paintings. Its windows might hold precious panes of stained glass. It was a space designed to inspire awe and devotion. But this holiness did not make it warm. In fact, the chapel was often one of the coldest and most difficult places in the entire castle. The high vaulted ceilings were designed to lift a person's soul toward heaven. They also lifted every single scrap of heat away from the people below. The vast empty space was impossible to warm effectively. The large windows were meant to let in divine light, but they also let in the earthly cold with brutal efficiency. Fires were often kept small or were forbidden entirely. The smoke could damage the sacred paintings and relics. The castle's priest or chaplain had to rise before anyone else in the household. He would make his way to the chapel in the deep pre-dawn darkness. He would kneel on the frozen and unforgiving stone floor for matins. His whispered words of praise would turn to white mist in the icy air. His fingers would grow numb as he held his prayer book. His duty demanded that he face the cold at its most powerful moment. His personal sleeping chamber was usually a small and simple room. It was often called a cell. This room was located near the chapel for his convenience. It was a space for prayer and study, not for worldly comfort. His bed was often just a hard wooden plank with a thin straw mattress. His blanket was a single sheet of rough wool. His life was meant to be one of quiet contemplation and humble hardship. For a deeply devout man of faith, this physical cold was also a spiritual tool. It was a form of penance, a way to share in the sufferings of the saints. The discomfort of the body was thought to purify the soul. To endure the cold without complaint was a sign of strong devotion. In this mindset, warmth was a worldly temptation, and the cold was a path that could bring a person closer to God. The chapel did have its own unique sources of warmth and scent. During a religious service, the light from dozens of beeswax candles would gently heat the air. The small flames would create a soft and flickering glow. The priest would also burn incense in a swinging thurible. The sweet and heavy smoke would fill the space with a holy fragrance. This scent became linked with the idea of a sacred and protected space. A very large castle might even house a few monks or chantry priests. They would live a communal life within the castle walls. They slept together in a long and cold dormitory, much like soldiers. Their warmth came from their shared discipline and their simple way of life. They would rise together in the darkness for their prayers. Their combined voices and body heat were a small defense against the chapel's chill. So the priest and the monk fought the cold with very different weapons. They used prayer and ritual as their primary shield. They used the idea of penance to give their suffering a higher meaning. Their survival was a matter of the spirit as much as it was a matter of the flesh. They were seeking a divine warmth that had nothing to do with a fireplace. a warmth they hoped to find in the next life, if not in this one. Now imagine the ultimate winter nightmare. An enemy army has appeared at the castle gates. The drawbridge is raised, and the portcullis is down. The long and slow battle against the cold has now become a desperate and violent fight for your life. All the normal routines of survival are shattered. The castle is no longer a home, it is a war machine, and you are trapped inside it. A siege puts a terrible and immediate strain on all vital resources. Firewood becomes as precious as gold. It must be strictly rationed. The great fires in the halls are shrunk down to save fuel for a potentially long struggle. Food is also carefully controlled. The hearty evening meals are replaced with smaller portions. The internal furnace of the body begins to burn low. The cold starts to gain a powerful advantage. For the soldiers of the garrison, sleep becomes a rare and stolen commodity. They cannot retreat to their barracks for a full night's rest. They must sleep in short and broken shifts. They often sleep still, wearing their leather and mail armor. They catch a few moments of rest on the cold stone of the battlements, or in a drafty gatehouse. A sudden shout in the dark could mean an immediate attack. Their sleep is never deep. The women and children and other non-combatants huddle together in the great hall. This is usually the safest and most central part of the castle. They listen to the frightening and alien sounds from outside the walls, the shouts of the enemy soldiers, the thud of a catapult stone hitting the castle. Sleep is impossible, chased away by the deep cold and the constant gnawing fear. Every shadow seems to hold a new threat. The night is now filled with a host of new and deadly dangers. The enemy might try to scale the walls under the absolute cover of darkness. A flaming arrow could be shot over the battlements. It could set the castle's dry wooden roofs ablaze. A fire inside the walls during a siege was a catastrophic event. Sentries on the walls had to watch for the enemy and for the smallest spark of a flame. The great hall might be transformed into a makeshift hospital. The long trestle tables would be covered with wounded men. The groans of the injured would fill the cold air. The smell of blood and rough medicine would mingle with the smoke. The healers would work by candlelight through the long night. The presence of so much suffering made true rest impossible for anyone. Winter itself becomes a powerful weapon in the siege. The attacking army suffers terribly in their frozen tents and muddy camps, but they hope that starvation and cold will force the castle to surrender. The defenders inside the walls pray for the opposite. They pray for a blizzard to bury the enemy army. They hope the bitter frost will break the spirit of the men outside their gates. The cold is an ally to no one. So during a siege, real and restful sleep completely disappears. It is replaced by a state of weary and constant watchfulness. You do not sleep. You simply wait for the dawn and for the next attack. The fight is now against two relentless enemies, the human enemy outside the walls, and the ancient enemy of the cold that is already inside with you. Every sunrise is a miracle, a sign that you have survived to fight another day. The castle was the great stone heart of the medieval landscape, but it was the home of only the powerful few, the lord, his family, and his soldiers. The true medieval world belonged to the peasant. To understand the full story of winter survival, we must leave the castle walls behind. We must walk down the muddy track to the small village that huddles in the castle's shadow. This is how the other 99% lived. The peasant did not live in a house of cold and permanent stone. He lived in a small, humble hut. The frame of this hut was made of timber. The walls were a mixture of woven branches, mud, and straw. This was a technique called wattle and daub. The roof was not made of slate or tile. It was a thick and heavy blanket of thatched reeds or straw. This was a house made from the earth itself. This humble cottage had a secret and powerful weapon against the cold. Its small size was its greatest advantage. The hut was often just a single, undivided room. This small space was much easier to heat than a vast and drafty castle chamber. The walls of earth and wood were also better natural insulators than stone, and the thick thatch on the roof was a remarkably effective barrier against heat loss. The fire was a simple, open hearth in the center of the earthen floor. There was usually no stone chimney. The smoke simply rose up into the high roof space. It would then slowly filter out through the porous thatch. This meant the air inside the hut was incredibly smoky. But it also meant that almost 100% of the fire's heat stayed inside the building. The smoke was the price you paid for that efficient warmth. The peasant family shared this single room with their most valuable animals. A cow or a few sheep might be brought inside for the night. They would sleep at one end of the hut, separated by a low screen. This was not just for the animals' safety. Their large bodies generated a tremendous amount of heat. This animal warmth was a vital and free contribution to the home's overall temperature. The family and their livestock kept each other alive. But this life was not an easy or romantic one. The air was incredibly thick with eye-watering smoke. The risk of a stray spark setting the dry thatch roof ablaze was a constant and terrible danger. The hut was crowded and lacked any form of privacy. The smells of unwashed bodies, livestock, and smoke all mingled together in the small space. It was survival on the most basic and intimate of terms. So, a strange and interesting question arises from this comparison. Who was actually warmer on a bitter winter night? The great lord shivering in his magnificent stone bedchamber, or the humble peasant huddled with his family and his cow in their small smoky hut? The answer is surprising. In terms of pure retained heat, the peasant often had the clear advantage. The lord and the peasant lived in two completely different worlds of cold. The lord suffered in a grand, drafty, and isolated space. The peasant suffered in a smoky, crowded, and stuffy one. Neither experience was comfortable by our modern standards, but the peasant's simple home was often the more effective machine for survival. The magnificent fortress was a master of defense against armies. The humble hut was a master of defense against the cold. A castle was not a static and unchanging monument of stone. It was a dynamic and living center of power. Its population could swell dramatically overnight. A great tournament, a royal visit, or the gathering of an army could triple the number of people inside the walls. The permanent stone buildings were not large enough to hold everyone. A different kind of shelter was needed for these great occasions. So large temporary buildings would spring up in the castle's open courtyard or bailey. Great halls were erected quickly from timber frames. Their walls were often made of simple wattle and daub, or even just heavy canvas. Their roofs were of thatch or oiled cloth. They were functional and disposable structures. They were the castle's practical answer to a sudden and massive flood of guests and soldiers. These temporary structures were a major step down in comfort from the main keep. They were incredibly drafty and noisy. Their thin walls offered very little real protection, a stark contrast to the thick and silent stone. Rain and snow could easily leak through the simple roofs. They were more like huge, elaborate tents than real buildings. They were a place to get out of the wind, but not a place to feel truly warm or secure. The heat in these great halls was raw and communal. A long open fire pit was often dug into the earthen floor. This fiery trench would run down the center of the building. People would arrange their simple sleeping pallets on either side of it. They would try to get as close to the flames as they dared without getting burned by a stray spark. This long line of fire was the building's only source of light and warmth. The hall at night was a vast and restless sea of sleeping bodies. Knights, squires, servants, and craftsmen all lay packed together, side by side. It was a place of incredible and constant noise, a symphony of snores, coughs, and muttered dreams. The air was filled with this restless human energy. There was no privacy and no silence to be found here. Sleep was something you had to snatch in the middle of the chaos. The smoke from the long open fire pits was thick and choking. There were no proper chimneys. The smoke simply rose to the high roof and slowly filtered out through vents or holes. It mingled with the heavy smell of hundreds of unwashed bodies and the scent of spilled ale and damp wool. To breathe the air in this hall was to taste the raw and unfiltered essence of the event itself. But this great and noisy crowd had one enormous advantage. The combined body heat of hundreds of people was an immense thermal force. The packed hall created its own unique microclimate. It was a huge bubble of human warmth that held the winter night at bay. An individual might be cold, but the collective was surprisingly warm. This was the brute force approach to survival. Life in these temporary halls was a strange and unique experience. The normal social rules were slightly relaxed. A wealthy knight might find himself sleeping only a few feet from a common soldier. It was a brief moment of shared and equal hardship, a raw and communal existence. Sleep was not a peaceful retreat. It was a necessary function performed in public, a brief rest before the next day's tournament or battle. We have seen the many different pieces of this great puzzle: the heavy woolen blankets and the smoky chamber fires, the warm spiced wine and the quiet whispered prayers, the thick stone walls and the clever woven tapestries. These were not separate and isolated tricks. They were all connected parts of one great and complex system, a system designed with a single and all-important purpose. The purpose was survival. Survival in the medieval winter was a war fought on many fronts at once. It was a battle of engineering against the drafts. It was a battle of chemistry with hot foods and drinks. It was a battle of biology using the shared warmth of living bodies. And it was a battle of faith against the fears of the long dark night. To win this war, you had to be a master of all these different arts. Your own body was the precious fortress at the very center of this war. Everything else was designed to protect it. The layers of clothing you wore were its inner walls. The thick blankets were its ramparts. The heavy bed curtains were its outer defenses. And the warmth from your food was the loyal garrison of soldiers defending you from within. You were the treasure that the entire system was built to guard. The entire castle became a kind of living ecosystem of warmth. The great fires in the kitchens and the hall were its beating heart. The servants were its bloodstream. They carried the fuel and the hot coals through the cold stone veins of the corridors. The nobles were the brain. They directed these resources to protect themselves. Every person and every object had a role to play in the castle's thermal life. There was no single magical solution to the problem of the cold. No one invention saved the people from freezing. It was the sum of 100 small and imperfect efforts, a victory that was won by inches, not by miles. A tapestry helped a little. A hot stone helped a little more. A dog at your feet helped even more. All these small advantages, when added together, were just enough to tip the balance from misery to survival. The true genius of these solutions was their profound simplicity. They were born from common sense and everyday materials. They did not require a deep knowledge of science. They required a deep knowledge of the world. They were the inventions of ordinary people, people who were facing an extraordinary and life-threatening challenge every single day of the winter. Their ingenuity was a quiet and practical kind of brilliance. We, in our modern world, have lost this deep and practical knowledge. Our battle against the cold is won by a thermostat on the wall. We no longer understand the intimate language of drafts and insulation. We have replaced 100 small skills with one single powerful technology. Our comfort is absolute and effortless, but we have lost the connection to our environment that medieval people were forced to learn. In the end, the true fire at the heart of the castle was the human spirit itself. It was the stubborn refusal to surrender to the cold. It was the cleverness to adapt and the courage to endure. It was the communal instinct to huddle together for shared warmth. This was the invisible flame that could never be extinguished by the howling winter wind. The stone was cold, but the will to live was warm. Did this world of relentless cold ever change? Did a knight living in the 15th century sleep any better than his great-grandfather in the 12th century? The answer is a slow and cautious yes. The Middle Ages were not a static and frozen period of history. Life did change, technology did improve, and the idea of what constituted a comfortable home slowly began to evolve. The progress was not fast, but it was real. The fireplace was one of the first and most important things to improve. Over the centuries, masons and builders learned from experience. They discovered how to build better and more efficient chimneys. A well-designed hood built over the hearth would help to guide the smoke upward. Flues became slightly narrower. This reduced the amount of heat that escaped. The fireplace was still a hungry and inefficient beast, but it was becoming a slightly tamer one. Glass also became more affordable and common over time. In the early castles, it was a near mythical luxury. By the later Middle Ages, it was becoming a standard feature in the homes of the wealthy. Small panes of glass were held together in a frame with strips of lead. For the first time in history, you could have a room with natural light that was not also filled with a biting wind. This was a revolutionary change. The interior of the castle also became more complex and private. Rooms became more divided and specialized. The idea of a private bedchamber for the lord and lady became a normal expectation. This was a space dedicated only to rest and privacy. Permanent wooden paneling became more fashionable than portable tapestries. This created a warmer and less drafty interior. The home was slowly being carved out of the fortress. More and better textiles became available to more people. The wool industry grew more efficient. This meant that blankets were more finely woven and more plentiful. Tapestries became larger and more common. This fabric wealth slowly began to trickle down the social ladder. A wealthy merchant might now have a bed that was just as fine as a minor noble's. Comfort was becoming a new way to display your success. Many of the old and purely functional castles were rebuilt or remodeled for greater comfort. Defense was still a primary concern, but it was no longer the only consideration. The fortified manor house began to replace the grim military keep. These new buildings had larger windows, they had more fireplaces. They were designed to be impressive homes that were also capable of being defended. But we must not exaggerate the scale of these changes. A late medieval castle was still a profoundly cold place by our standards. The improvements made life less brutal, but not truly comfortable. The fundamental problem of the massive, uninsulated stone walls remained. The technology of the time could only do so much. The daily and nightly battle against the cold was still the central reality of winter life. Perhaps the most important change of all was a slow shift in thinking. People began to believe that comfort was not an impossible dream. They began to see it as something that could be engineered and expected. This new idea was the first seed from which our modern warm world would eventually grow. The desire for comfort was the driving force, a force that would one day conquer the cold stone of the castle for good. The darkness does not vanish in a single glorious instant. It slowly and reluctantly gives way to a pale and ghostly gray. This is the first light of a long-awaited winter dawn. It is a thin and watery light that seems to struggle against the lingering night. It seeps through the cracks in the shutters. It paints the cold stone walls in shades of gray and silver. The night is over, but the day has not yet found its strength. The first sound you hear is the distant crowing of a rooster in the bailey. Then comes the muffled shout of a guard as the morning watch is changed. The great bell of the chapel might ring out its first call to prayer. The castle is slowly remembering that it is a living place. The profound silence of the deep night is broken by these first stirrings of human activity. A new day is being born. In the revealing gray light, the bedchamber looks harsh and tired. The magical glow of the fire is gone. The hearth is just a pile of cold and lifeless white ash. The air is stale, a ghost of last night's smoke and restless sleep. The fine tapestries look dull and heavy on the walls. The morning light does not flatter the medieval room. It exposes all of its cold and weary reality. You lie still for a moment under the heavy blankets. You take a silent and automatic inventory of your own body. Your joints are stiff and ache from the deep, damp chill. Your feet throb with a familiar coldness. You take a deep breath and feel the sharpness of the air in your lungs. You are alive and you have survived. But the night has taken its small and customary payment from your flesh and bones. Then the servants arrive in a sudden rush of purposeful activity. They move with an energy born of long practice. They throw open the heavy shutters, letting the full morning light flood the room. They carry out the chamber pot. They bring in a basin of icy water for washing. And most importantly, they begin the vital work of rebuilding the fire. They coax the last faint embers back into a new and living flame. The first meal of the day is a simple and practical affair. It is often just a piece of dark, heavy bread and a cup of small ale. It is not a feast, it is fuel. The food helps to restart your body's internal furnace. The ale takes the edge off the morning's aches. You eat quickly, standing by the newly lit fire. You try to absorb the heat from the flames and the energy from the food at the same time. The sun is now fully above the horizon. A weak shaft of pale yellow light might fall across the rushes on the floor. You might step into this patch of sunlight. It has no real physical warmth, but it feels like a promise from God. It is a reminder of the power and glory of the sun, a symbol of hope that the long winter will not last forever. This small moment of light is a precious gift, and so the great daily cycle begins once more. The battle of the night is over, but the war against the cold is never truly won. The servants are already gathering more wood for the coming evening. The cooks are already planning the hot supper that will fortify the household. The entire castle is rearming and resupplying itself. It is preparing for the next inevitable siege of darkness and cold. Our long journey through the medieval night is now coming to an end. We have walked the cold stone corridors together. We have huddled by the smoky fires. We have felt the weight of the heavy woolen blankets. It is time to leave this harsh and distant world behind. We can now return to the comfort of our own time, but we will carry the echoes of their struggle with us. The great lesson of the castle is one of profound resilience. The people who lived within these walls were not passive victims of the cold. They were active and brilliant survivors. They fought back with a complex system of their own invention, a system of architecture and textiles, a system of community and faith, a system of practical wisdom, a deep knowledge of how to make a home in a hostile world. The echoes of their world can still be found in our own. The challenges we face are very different, but the fundamental human needs remain the same. The need for warmth, for safety, and for community. As you lie in your own bed tonight, take a moment to appreciate the simple miracle of your comfort. The central heating that hums so quietly. The glass in your windows that keeps the wind at bay. These are the luxuries they could only dream of. The great stone castles still stand today. They are silent and empty monuments on wind-swept hills. The fires are out. The tapestries have crumbled to dust. The people themselves are long gone. But the stones, remember, they are the silent witnesses to the countless nightly battles that were fought and won within their embrace. They are a testament to the quiet endurance of the human spirit. If you have enjoyed this journey into the past, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. We have many more quiet stories to share with you from the forgotten corners of history. We are grateful that you chose to spend this time with us. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your presence here is greatly appreciated. Now let the story of the castle fade away. Let the images of stone and smoke dissolve into the darkness of your own room. The long battle of the medieval night is over. Your own time for peaceful rest has begun. There are no drafts to fight. There is no fire to tend. There is only the simple and easy task of letting go. Feel the gentle weight of your own blanket. Listen to the quiet and steady rhythm of your own breathing. You are safe and you are warm. The great struggles of the past are just a distant story now. Your only duty is to rest, to allow your mind to grow quiet, and to allow your body to sink deep into a peaceful and restorative sleep. The last embers of our story are now fading. The night is yours. May it be a night of profound peace. May your dreams be gentle and kind, and may you wake in the morning feeling rested and refreshed. Sleep well, sweet dreams.